Hey, this is Zacklog the Great, and I am here tonight with Harry Seldon.
Good evening.
And we are also joined by Overgrown Hobbit.
I?
Who is half of the team behind the webcomic Vegfolk Fables, which you can find on Arctoons. And I will put a link to that in the show description. If you would like to give people a brief rundown of what that one is.
Well, if you've watched Zacklog before, you know that it is a mix of Oz and the Muppets and VeggieTales all kind of rolled up and given a shot of bourbon and sent off their merry to have some fun. Vegetarians, please, you're not welcome.
Okay, and having said that, we are getting together tonight to talk about Jim Butcher's novel, the first in the Dresden Files, Stormfront. We have done a few, I've covered a few of his other books, although it has been later in the series, so we're actually going to rewind all the way back to the beginning tonight. Before we get to that, I did want to mention, if you like my work, if you like my channel, you want to support it, you can go to subscribestar.com/Zacklog-the-great, and that link will also be in the show description. And I wanted to give a shout out to Ann H. Thank you for supporting the channel. So, having said that, also, we're not really going to pay attention to things like spoilers. They were going to be most likely all through this discussion. So if you haven't read this yet, and you find the general idea interesting, you might go read it and then come back and listen to this.
If you want to know whether or not we like it, if you want to know whether or not we like it and whether or not we recommend it, well, we kept the last book we read was book 15, and we're still on the series. So there is a definite upper bound as to how much we could possibly dislike the books.
True. And we are going to give you a little summary of why it's awesome at the very beginning, so that if you decide, maybe I should read this and not get spoilers, we'll be here when you get back.
So, anyway, so having said all of that, Overgrown Hobbit, if you would like to take over and explain the general idea of the book for us, and then we'll get rolling.
Okay, it is Y2K, and in the Chicago phone book, you will find an ad for Harry Dresden Wizard. Lost items found, paranormal investigations, consulting, advice, reasonable rates, no love potions, endless purses, parties, or other entertainment. Harry Blackthorne Copperfield Dresden is the only wizard in the Chicago phone book. Most people think he's a joke or a con man, but Dresden is the real thing. And as it turns out, he can make a mean love potion. He just won't do it. Not for money, anyway. Who is Harry Dresden? Imagine Harry Potter as an American orphan, and his foster family isn't the Dursleys, it's Voldemort. And that's our magician hero as an adult in Dresden Files. No one came to rescue Harry Dresden. He had to fight his own way free from the evil Magus. To survive, he's had to use magic to kill and to make deals with some very shady people. True, most of the wizarding community know his name because he's infamous. He's not the boy who lived. He's the man who they all distrust and some despise. He's got his own special watcher from the White Council of Wizards, and if he puts 1 foot wrong... Meanwhile, Harry's got a living to make on the mean streets of Chicago, and he can't be too choosy about the jobs he takes. And not when some hot dame walks into his office and she smells like trouble. You got to pay the bills. So whether it's helping a distraught wife track down her missing husband who might have gotten involved in some serious dark juju, or consulting with the local cops when something pings their, okay, this is seriously weird meter, he keeps finding himself in hot water. Now, it's a good thing the guy can laugh at all the crazy stuff in his life. But his sense of humor is not merely twisted, but actually sprained. This is a guy who cannot stop himself from mouthing off at demons from hell or just a really obnoxious cop. So, Harry's life is complicated and crazy, and the consequences are often painful for him and nearly always amusing for us, the readers. Sometimes funny, always exciting, Stormfront begins the adventures of an outsider struggling to find his way. He wants to do right. He's tempted by the power he could wield if he really were as bad as they all claim he is. He's even more tempted by the desire to use that power to fix the wrongs that officious bullies and uber-powerful magicians and just plain jerks inflict on ordinary, decent folks. Harry Dresden and his adventures make for a thoroughly entertaining action adventure, and the books are compulsively readable. So if you haven't read them yet, go get them and come back and join us.
Okay. Thank you, Mrs. Hubbard, for the summary. And I guess we should ask the other Harry tonight if you would like to start us off with your overall thoughts on the book.
My overall thoughts on the book was I did not realize just how long it had been since I first read them until I reread and noticed that things like phone books and payphones existed. And I'm not even joking.
No.
It has been quite some time since I first read the series, and the world has really changed since then. And when you read one book at a time as they come out, not that I've read the whole thing, I wasn't reading in 2000, but when you read one book at a time as they come out, it's easy to let the background details slip by. Some things, though, there was a tiny little detail. I did not know that the slang word simp dated back all the way to 2000s or earlier, but it showed up in this book. I was as surprised as anybody. I was also surprised in hindsight at how well it held together as an independent story. Obviously, you could read it, and there were all kinds of details where he explicitly said, I do have a godfather, and she is inevitably perhaps a fairy, but that's another story. But it holds together much better than I expected it to when you're reading it just independently.
Yeah, and it's let's see. Yeah, this was published in 2001, I think. And payphones and phone books that were actually used regularly. They were on the way out, but they were still out there. So yes. So one kind of overall big picture thing for me is like, if you wanted to like describe this book for someone in as the general tone of the book in as quick a way as possible, I think you could accurately call it hard-boiled private detective fiction meets meets wizards and fantasy, which is an interesting way to approach a thing like this. And it actually reminds me of something I heard from another author I like. Are they? Yeah, you can see actually a couple of them down here, which is Terry Pratchett. And one thing he said in terms of like writing advice, although I don't know where I saw this now anyway, one thing he said was import, don't recycle. That is, if you're writing space opera, don't just read a bunch of space opera and then do the same kind of things you see other people have done, because you're just redoing things. Read other things, look at other things, and grab ideas and grab tropes from other genres, because and put that in there, and the collision of these different kinds of ideas can produce interesting results. And I think that is a good. I think this series is an application of that. I also, since this is the first book, I also thought it was an interesting description of the series I saw one time. Someone said that this is the sneakiest epic fantasy series they've ever read.
Yes.
I was just about to say that.
Yeah, because you read this one and it's this
it's a detective story first and foremost.
Yeah, and it's just this one guy in Chicago mostly trying to sort out a couple of murders. And then 5 books later, he's taking on people who are trying to ascend to godhood. And then another 8 books after that, he's actually he's actually throwing punches with actual gods and titans. And so it's but at no one point does it make this huge jump. Each book slowly builds up the scale until you're like, wait, where did we start?
And almost everything in the book that comes out later with this scale that starts like little bitty and then it's like woof into this universe destroying mega epic adventure is all present in that first book. So he stuck the firearm, or since it's science fiction, the octopus on the mantle back in book 1 and set up this entire complicated world, and it with all these different layers to it, just in passing, and then bit by bit he keeps expanding outwards, so it feels very natural. It doesn't feel like that thing where it's like, oh gosh, I've got my superhero too high powered, now I don't have a story anymore,
Oh god. Okay, by the way, referencing that, Orson Scott Card, just a general rule I eventually developed for him: if he starts a new series, read the first 2 books, sometimes 3, but just stop there. Because it doesn't get any better after that point.
True.
The first 2 are usually really good, but after 3, or it continues, his heroes get too overpowered and he doesn't know what to do anymore. Is a pretty common thing, and it's anyway. But also in terms of setting things up, and I'm going to refer. I don't remember where I picked this up either, but Jim Butcher said at some point that he actually laid down a lot of things that would become significant in the series in book 3, which is Grave Peril. Well, and in not just in book 3, but a particular scene in book 3. And I actually went back and reread that a year or so ago, and having read the rest of the series up to that point, I'm like, oh, well, yeah, and I see how that happened. And so in terms of actually laying down clues, that's a big one. But let's see. Having said that,
in microcosm, it's not something I noticed is that Dresden himself, obviously he gets far better and more experience with magic over the course of the series, but physically speaking, he is not that physically capable in this book. Yes, every time he gets in a fight, a fist fight, right up until the end, he actually loses it. His reflexes are just barely good enough to let him survive with magic, but he gets clobbered several times by people just sneaking up behind him without magic.
Yeah, but it makes sense later on for him to try to, as things get more dangerous, actually take some effort.
Absolutely, it does. Well, it's just another instance of the kind of pacing and the kind of patience that Jim Butcher had with this. Is that in this book, he is not. Most hard-boiled detectives will win that street fight right up until the time they need to get clonked on the head for some convenient amnesia for the plot to move forward.
Yep.
But otherwise, they'll be able to take 5 guys in an alleyway, no problem. And that's not Dresden in this book yet.
And even later, he doesn't really get that tough until way later in this series.
Right, but it's gradual. We see before he gets this, and I don't want to go too much into details. There is a point at which he gets extremely physically capable, but even well before that, we see him doing more and more running, more and more endurance activities. We see him. His rationale is that some people jog because they want the exercise, but he jogs because he's on the running end of monsters quite frequently, and he does not want to be slow when that happens.
Well, and another thing in terms of how he fares in fights in this book, and this is a general thing about the character, because like partway through the book he starts taking some pretty significant physical injury, and they keep on happening, and this all happens over the course of like 5 days, so he doesn't really have time to heal either. And so by the time he's getting to fist fights in the in the climax, like he's got about like 3 or 4 serious injuries he's trying to overcome in terms of this, which is also why at some point, when I was reading one of these books, I looked on TV tropes to see if there was a thing, and I don't know if I had the name right, but I was thinking a Chew Toy Hero. And it could be just because like the sheer amount of abuse that physical abuse that Harry Dresden consistently takes in the different books. I think Jim Butcher has said he sometimes takes a perverse pleasure in injuring and
torturing
tormenting
his poor protagonist.
Yes, as much as possible.
He does. As he goes on, he explains. You learn more about it in the next couple books. Explains why they tend to heal a little faster, why wizards are more long-lived. They're not subject to some of the same diseases and issues that regular humanity is because of their contact with the supernatural. But yeah, by the final battle, he has a concussion, severe enough to knock him out for a day that he's just barely recovered from. It's been, less than 48 hours since he was so concussed that he threw up and his eyes wouldn't track. He was punched in the gut several times. He's been picked up and spat on with acid. And he's been, again, picked up and thrown around a room. And I
don't think he acid. I don't think the acid hit him.
Oh no, he got hit.
The couch got hit by the acid.
No, I'm talking about the scorpions. The scorpion.
Oh yes, you're right.
Yeah,
and they ripped a bit out of his leg.
Yep. Because they were. It was giving him hallucinations. Just the skin contact from the contact poison. So yes, he's been poisoned. He's been concussed. He's been shot, and he's been beaten by blunt objects by having his body thrown around. So yeah, at the end of the book, when he's hanging by one arm and falls to the ground and then passes out and wakes up later, figuring that I'm probably dead, it makes perfect sense. There's he might have survived the boss battle, but yeah, he doesn't expect to survive it actually.
HP, yes.
Yeah.
And it's not surprising that, all things considered, that he ends the story in the hospital, and that the final chapter covers quite a bit of time, more time, in fact, than the entire rest of the book, just to give him enough time to get out of the hospital again.
Yep, and go on a date, which I was so happy for him. I love it when the authors aren't so mean to their heroes, and after like blocking them from getting the girl, they get to have a little date at the end. So I find that very cheering.
Well, for a little while.
Well, he's a Chuto hero, right? So he can't stay good for long. But the book ends on a real nice, upbeat note,
Okay, so let's see. I have a set of notes here. I took as I was going along chapter by chapter. One thing I in the very first chapter, not like seriously plot related or anything, but science, the largest religion of the 20th century. And I'm like, yeah. In common usage, the science has ceased to be what people traditionally think of as what science should be, and has basically become a religion, which is why it can be abused to to promote just about anything, as long as it's detrimental to human well-being.
All the good promises that science promised us didn't come to pass. Remember, the evil monsters who tell us to trust the science, and it turns out that they've been murdering people since Reagan's era for profit. And every time you look around, it turns out the people promising you the science, the medical profession, which is supposed to end disease, isn't. That they're supposed to save little kids, aren't. He just lists all the things: violence and crime and war. The cities are burning. The wars are never ending. In spite of the advance in technology, the utopia isn't here. And so now people are starting to open their eyes again to the world of supernatural, particularly supernatural evil of demons and monsters. La plus ça change, la plus jamais
I was about to say, all things considered, the science seems slightly more benevolent than some of the magic we see in this book. So, yes. Just because things are bad doesn't mean you can't make them worse. True. Might be one of the early yes. morals of the story.
Mm-hmm. I think Harry would agree to that one. Mm-hmm. So let's see. Okay, so there's one thing. It's kind of inevitable, but I don't want this entire talk to turn into it. But it's kind of inevitable that we're going to compare elements from this book to things later in this series.
We've already started that horse is.
I don't want that to be everything. Everything we're going to say, but there's definitely going to be some of that. And so let's see. Relatively early on, we meet Johnny Marcone. And in terms of how he comes across in this book, I think it pretty well fits the character from the rest of the series. I don't feel like I see. It seems consistent. It seems like the same kind of person. And so that was kind of nice to see. And also, we had the very first Soul Gaze with Johnny Marcone. Which actually is not consistent with the rest of the series. The way he describes those tends to gets. This description is basically exposition about the character of Johnny Marcone, whereas other ones he describes, he basically paints a scene, he turns it into a picture. A kind of waking dream of this person that Harry enters into, and so that was changed. One other thing. So the very first chapter, this woman comes in. She's like, "Can you please help me find my husband?" Mm-hmm. And Harry's like. And Harry's a little hesitant. He's like, not the kind of thing I usually do. Have you talked to the police? Which I thought was kind of funny because throughout the series, outside of combat, outside of throwing fire at people, probably the most commonly used spell you see Harry doing is a basic tracking spell. And so I did think it was kind of funny that he was like, I don't know if I should be doing that one. And it's like, you do this one all the time.
This is a setup for the virtue of the character. One of the things I was reading this for, going back and reading it again last night, was all the tropes and tricks that the author uses to tell a good tale. And one of them is describing the character, introducing you to the character in a very smooth and seamless way. So you learn all kinds of interesting things about him. And And it's critical to the story for the payoff at the end that you can believe that this is a guy who would be seriously tempted, that you believe that this is a guy who has done wrong things in the past and could do them again, but you never really doubt that in a struggle for good versus evil within your own soul, that it's a real struggle, that he actually desires good. Because the first thing they tell you about him is that he will cut off his own nose and his own profit if it's not honest. He could have made real bank with that movie star or the country music star. He needs the money badly, but he won't lie to him, and he'll tell him a hard truth like, dude, get off the drugs and you'll get a lot better, okay? Instead of doing a fake exorcism.
I don't know if either of you... Oh, go for it. Go ahead.
No, he tells her that, look, I'm expensive. If you just have a mundane issue with your husband, I'm going to cost a lot more than a private detective, and they'll do a better job at what you need for the cost you're going to pay. My specialty is the supernatural. So if you need wizardly help, my rates are very reasonable because no one else is going to be able to do what I do. But if you just need mundane help, go hire a private detective. It's cheaper, because he's not going to abuse the trust or hurt this woman in need just to make buck, even though he needs it rather badly. And that's a real telling thing.
Either of you have ever watched or read Mob Psycho 100,
no.
But he reminded me a lot of. There is a character there who is also an exorcist, and there are a lot of similarities in that ordinary people can't always tell whether or not a given exorcist or a given psychic in this universe is legitimate or not. And even so, he will turn down cases. He will refuse to do things, or he will refuse to pretend to do a ritual that he knows isn't going to do anything. Even if he could do it and he could take the money and no one would be the wiser. He's not going to do something that won't actually fix the problem that he's being paid to fix.
Another interesting thing about the first chapter or the characters here, we have Monica, and this doesn't show up yet, but I think this is kind of a thing from the like I said, the hard-boiled detective stories, which I actually don't think I've read any of them. I probably should, just to find out. But the client, especially if it's a woman, is likely to be almost as much danger as the person you're pursuing. And that one definitely comes out in this one. She in this case, it's not because she's malicious, but she is in many ways almost as much trouble to him as the other things he's trying to the other people he's trying to get sorted out. And so that's an interesting, like I said, pulling in things from other from different kinds of stories. Anyway,
I think I think the detective novels, the handful that I've read from that period, or the movies you might have seen, like the Maltese Falcon or any of those classic films, the women are trouble. I mean, come on, even if she's a dame with a heart of gold, she's trouble. And if you're a man, that's got to be true, right?
I think
it's classic.
From a male perspective, all women are varying amounts of trouble, and this is one way of putting that into words on paper that make a good story.
Yeah, I shook my head, bewildered. They say we wizards are subtle, but believe you me, we got nothing at all on women. Yeah.
Okay. So again, I'm kind of skimming over notes here. Chapter 5. And he goes to Mac's bar for some Macanalis for a sandwich and a drink, which also I got a lot of these books as audiobook. I don't know if the first one I read was as audiobook, so I knew what it was. I suspect that name comes over a little bad for some people in print.
Oh yeah.
But anyway, chapter 5. This is something Butcher uses several times throughout the series. I hate quirked as a verb. Like, so-and-so quirked an eyebrow or quirked a smile. And I'm like, I have never heard someone actually say that. I've never heard that word used, and it's not like, some, big vocabulary word that's only going to show up in specific circumstances. And so so-and-so quirked a smile, and it comes up a couple times in this book, comes up in several of the later ones. I think he's more or less dropped it by the
only
most
shows
recent
up
books.
It only shows up once in chapter 26 of this book, and it doesn't show up in any of the other books. It only once in my edition. I don't know if there have been multiple editions. I might have a more recent one than yours.
Did you look up the past tense or just the
okay, you're right. I looked up never mind. I just looked at the present tense. I thought that would get them both, and it didn't.
Also, I just pulled up.
That is quite a lot, actually.
I just pulled up etymology online and to check the word, and it turns out if you're willing to be super duper archaic, quirk comes from slanted or twisted. So if you said that a slanted smile, it could work. Although the later meaning that we now use, a quibble and artful evasion, makes that phrase completely nonsensical and wrong. So it just depends, on how archaic you are, which this book is not. So fair cop.
And I've heard the adjective quirky. So and so is quirky, odd, eccentric. I wouldn't argue with that, but the verb just annoys the heck out of me. Anyway,
I hate interrogate as a verb. So to describe a document, people interrogate the document. So.
Oh.
Yeah. What is talking back to you? Unless it's Hagrid's book of the monster book of monster that eats you. You're not interrogating it.
And weirdly enough, that usage doesn't show up in this book, even though, you could have books that could potentially talk back.
Yes. You can literally interrogate the text.
Yes.
That would definitely be in one of Terry Pratchett's books. That's the kind of thing someone would have to deal
100%.
with. The librarian of Unseen University is probably quite experienced at interrogating a text.
He makes it roll over and cry uncle.
But anyway, let's see. Like I said, I have kind of notes on various chapters. So chapter 6, he goes out to the lake house that that Victor Sells has, and he and it's kind of funny because he's there as he's describing this. I'm like, oh, this is actually just pretty basic detective work. Mm-hmm. This is what anyone, magical or not, would do to figure out the situation. And we meet fairies, in this case Toot Toot, whose full name he is emphatically not revealing. I did think it was kind of interesting, even even here, dealing with fairies, he's actually still exercising basic detective work. It's like, hey, do you know anyone who might have seen something? Ask around, hit up your network.
Talking to Johnny the Shoeshine guy who knows a guy who knows a guy.
Yeah, in fact, I didn't think of this comparison until just now, but this is these are the Baker Street irregulars.
Yes. Mm-hmm. They are. They are indeed. And they're street urchins too. They're just absolutely like the urchins from Sherlock Holmes.
And he pays them in pizza, which totally fits that.
Oh, the other thing that's cool about this that I like is that with the soul gaze, and like you said, it does change later in the book to become more mystical, more this sort of supernatural poetic thing, and there's a lot more of the poetry and the sense of wonder and these currents of great good, great evil, and the meanings for the soul and poetry in the stories. But it starts off as very much science as magic, magic as science. It's a technology. It's just not one that we mundanes understand. So he sets up the rules the same way like David Weber or a guy writing Mill SF will set up the rules for the battleships and the grazers and the lasers and the torpedoes and everything, so that when you have the boss fight at the end, the characters and you, the reader, understand the payoff of why the characters win and how they use this thing tactically. So that whole scene with the ferry, besides being great detective work and absolutely hilarious, at the very end, when the bad guy makes a mistake, you see it because he told you about it at the beginning in a way that was totally a red herring, and then boom, it pays off because now you see the technology that he's described of how magic works in action, and it's like, ha, and the victory is totally earned. I went to school. I know how this works. You're just a dumb script kiddie using magic. So it's really cool. I love that.
There was also, okay, so I have actually another question in my notes
enough,
here.
Is it not a comparison that Harry Dresden himself would ever have made or thought of?
No.
Go ahead, Zach Luck.
But from the same chapter, I actually have because later in the story we find out this lake house is very, very bad place, and Harry didn't get. And I have a little note here why didn't Harry get any bad vibes from the house? And also later in the story, as he's approaching it, the final confrontation, Harry opens his sight to see what's going on, and it's just blazingly obvious. By the way, this is a very bad place. Mm-hmm. And in a badly told story, or if you're not paying attention, you might ask yourself, well, why didn't he do that in the first place? But this is not a badly told story, and I was paying attention, which brings me to another thing, actually referencing Orson Scott Card again. Limitations make for good stories. Mm-hmm. Okay, why didn't Harry just view the place with his wizard sight to find out what was going on? He tells you, although he doesn't tell you it here, he tells you over the course of the story, you must be very, very careful with that, because anything you see with that is permanently emblazoned on your brain, and you can see some pretty horrible things. We actually find out what that's like several books down the row. And so, like I said, limitations make for a good story. A smart wizard is not going to just use his wizard sight every 10 seconds, because it can if he catches a glimpse of the wrong thing, that can produce serious problems for him, debilitating problems actually. And so that was another interesting thing from this chapter and from the story as a whole.
Mm-hmm. One thing he put on the table very early on was when you get in chapter 2, when you meet Karen Murphy, his contact at the police department. He mentions that their shadows had tangled together in a way that kind of bothered him, but he was focused on other stuff, and so he didn't really pay attention to it. And later on, you learn that he's got a funky shadow because of just something that happened a while ago that so you know that he's been doing this stuff for a while. He Who Walks Behind is an issue for him, some old case, just like. And I don't recall whether or not that actually pays out later in the series. whether the fact that he had this like, why is my shadow looking weird next to Karen Murphy's shadow in this book? There's something odd about that, but then events move on. He doesn't know why it's bugging him, and and the story moves on at such a pace you don't really remember it unless you're reading it now to talk about it. So do you guys remember anything about shadows coming into play later with him and Karen in the series? Because it's been a while since I've read the whole series back to back.
Now you're putting us on the spot. I know the place you're talking about, chapter 2.
Mm-hmm.
We rode the elevator in a sudden silence. No, hold on. I'm reading the wrong paragraph.
I can find it here. Let's see.
Or maybe I was just projecting it onto her. The confines of the elevator made me a bit nervous. I licked my lips and looked around the interior of the car. My shadow and Murphy's fell on the floor and almost looked as though they were sprawled there. There was something about it that bothered me, a nagging little instinct that I blew off as a case of nerves.
That doesn't look like anything magical to me. That just looks like if you have multiple light sources in a room, things are going to have more than one shadow, and shadows can intersect.
Mm-hmm.
He did keep a shadow in a handkerchief later on in the book, but I don't think that's related.
No, that was sunlight in handkerchief, or is the shadow in the handkerchief?
He had kept a flickering shadow in the handkerchief before transferring sunlight into it.
There you go. Good point.
But again, I don't think that's actually related.
Do you think it could just be, foreshadowing your sign of quality entertainment, that the rupture that occurs with him and Murphy, they were tangled together and it's giving him unease, so he's got some precognition going on that things are going to go sour? Or
it's possible, but we could easily be reading too much into it there.
Yeah.
Unless it's directly a reference to He Who Walks Behind, who is described explicitly in this book, and who is he's described as a shadow following Harry.
But that was also a shadow following Harry. That was also a shadow following Harry from someone that has the wizard sight, blown open.
Yes, who was able to see it.
So that wasn't a normal, like that paragraph to me looked like it was talking about a normal kind of shadow. So,
yeah,
I don't know.
I'm inclined to agree.
Like I said, it's this weird little thing, and since I haven't read the whole series yet, a lot of the stuff that in this book that he mentions as a throwaway line gets paid off in books 3, 4, 5 down the road, like the whole deal with the fairy godmother, and some of the other things that happened, like my first girlfriend, that ended badly because I killed her, so.
Yes.
And it's just
well, she didn't actually, but
no, but it's still
almost everything that almost all the little details do pay off. I think that might just be him being nervous.
A red herring.
It could be.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see.
I mean, because all the stuff that the shadow related monsters here is mostly Nicodemus in the series in general. I mean, but I don't think there's any indication that he's involved in this.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's I think it really is a throwaway line.
Yep.
Wow.
So I was trying to remember if there's anything to do with Karen later on, that her shadow might have led my little bit of foreshadowing to something that's going on with Karen herself, and something that's haunting her, or something that's going to take her out later in the series, emotionally, psychically, that kind of thing.
We also
I know there does, but I just don't remember what caused it in detail.
Well, we also do have a hold on, let me see if I can find where it was described as a hologram at one point.
Oh, that was that was when he was fighting when he was being chased by the demon that Victor had summoned, and he saw Victor projecting himself to observe and threaten him.
Chapter 14.
14, yeah.
I almost jumped out of my skin. I picked up my staff in both hands and turned in a slow circle, searching for the source of the voice. Who's there? There, to one side, a spot of cold. Not physical cold, but something deeper and darker that my other senses detected. A pooling of shadows, an illusion in the darkness between lights, gone when lightning flashed and back again when it had passed. Do you expect me to give you my name? The shadows scorned. Suffice to say that I am the one who has killed you. That might actually be it. I'd forgotten. It was described as a projection or a hologram, but it's also explicitly described here as the shadows.
Yes.
And Victor sells himself as the Shadow Man.
And he's been stalking Harry, and would have been stalking Harry and Karen by that point, possibly, as the only person in the book who can thwart his plans. Because he's,
Yeah, I don't think that's a throwaway line for later in the series. I think that's this.
That makes sense.
I think that is quite literally foreshadowing.
Okay. Well done. Well done, Mr. Butcher. Right. Alrighty.
Okay, so let's see. Oh. I'm trying to say whether I want to skip ahead. Okay, one thing that was kind of funny to me, and I had mentioned, I had alluded to this to Harry before. Let's see. I'll have to skip several chapters ahead. Which chapter is that? Oh yeah. Okay, so chapter 21. And Harry is at the Cell's house, and he's talking to Monica, and she's finally coming clean and giving him the whole story, and she's describing her husband, and he was a basically decent, ordinary guy, and he starts getting involved in magic, and he starts creating drugs to make a bunch of money, and he gets involved in this much bigger thing, and ends up killing people, gets into conflicts with gangsters, and I'm looking at this, I'm like, this is magical Breaking Bad.
Yes, it is. It really is.
Yeah.
This is noticeably before Breaking Bad as well, so maybe Jim Butcher should have his attorneys give the show writers a call.
Yeah, and then the show writers will say, "Well, hey, you had your TV show, and we had ours, and look at the rating comparison between the two."
Oh, that was a terrible TV show. The model they used for that, there was a TV show that came out that was really funny about a spy who had been dumped in Florida. CIA had been burn notice, and it had the voiceover and it had the spy, and the way they did that is exactly how they should have done Harry Dresden in sci-fi, but instead they did the opposite. They flipped it so that the guy was always talking tough in the voiceover and then completely flailing around and being ineffective in the TV show. I guess to create artificial risk.
It was a shame to watch.
So I was really pissed off at it.
Well, I'm glad that in Arrow they gave him an excuse in one episode, thanks to some hallucinogens. They gave Paul Blackthorne an excuse to do magic, which I'm pretty sure was a deliberate shout out.
So, anywho, it was it absolutely reversed the character of the book, whereas, and it shows up later in the series when how he thinks of himself and how the world sees him. He finally gets a clue as to what other people see, because he's beaten, he's bowed, he's taken it, and yet he is cracking wise and insulting and not backing down 1 inch, even though it's the better part of valor would be a little politeness. No, he's just boom, and he's getting away with it because he manages by the skin of his teeth to survive. So from the point of view of people outside, he's badass, even though they have to show him getting beaten up and taking all this pain and getting a chew toy. But his internal monologue is all very self-deprecating, right? they flipped that in the television show, and they had the internal monologue be like very braggadocio, very grandiose, and then they saw him getting beaten up and taking a hurt and being ineffective. I just found that painful to watch, really painful. The absolute opposite of who the character was.
Yeah.
But the actor did look like Harry Dresden. I'll give him that, in my mind.
He looked like Harry Dresden, aside from being about a foot too short. But I don't know how many
that's going to be tough
actors there are.
Yeah.
No, I understood that. And the fact that he was the same height as Murphy was a little bit jarring coming from the books.
Yeah.
But I get it, because if you have a 2-foot difference between your lead character's heights and you try to frame a horizontal TV camera on that, you're not going to have a good time. No. So that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a lot about the look of the TV show that was really nice. I just hated the fact that
the characterization was not there. Yeah.
And that's what I love about the books the most, is the people in it.
There's let's see. Actually, so since I was there a minute ago, still on chapter 21, the little girl Jenny comes out after the conversation with her mother, and she says, my daddy used to be one of the good guys. And I just read that, I'm like, how do you lose that with your kid?
Well, he never was to begin with.
Well, and the other thing is,
I'm not sure about that.
Okay, Harry, tell me what you think.
Well, no, let's act like finish.
Okay.
Well, and effectively, she doesn't come out and say it, but she more or less says, "I hope you kill him," because she knows enough to know there's not really a lot of ways this can go. And I was kind of thinking about that, and like what could get me to make such destructive choices, and then I look at how I actually am and how I actually run my life, and I'm like, well, it would be one little thing, and then another little thing, and then a slightly bigger thing, and it actually reminded me of a C.S. Lewis poem, which I've done for this channel, which is Nearly They Stood.
Oh, yes.
Which scares the hell out of me every time I think about it, because to dissect it and rip it up, the basic idea is there are people who have destroyed themselves, have damned themselves. They may not be aware of it until long after it's happened. There may be this invisible line they crossed, past which there's no way back, there's no way to redemption, and they may have passed that long before they realized what happened. And I think about that, and I look at my own life, and I'm like, what if I'm over one of those and didn't know? Because little things add up. Mm-hmm. And also something C.S. Lewis has hammered on a number of times. It's like it doesn't take murder to destroy yourself, to send yourself to hell. It doesn't take being this mustache twirling villain. All it takes is turning who you are inside to the wrong ends. Mm-hmm. And it can be externally relatively small things that send you that way. Mm-hmm. So
yeah,
having said that,
yeah, makes sense. Makes sense.
Well, and actually, later in the series, Harry even talks about, the idea of, actually, it's in either Battleground or what was the one before that?
Peace Talks?
Or either Peace Talks or Battleground. He talks about, the idea of selling your soul, and he realizes in some cases, you do that, not out of, corruption or evil, but because there's something you have to do, but doing it is going to rip a piece out of you. Becoming the kind of person who can do that is, damaging in itself, but what other option is there?
Well,
if I recall correctly, the way he phrased it was, I know every step I took to get here, and I don't know where I am. Which was a very good way of putting it, I thought.
Well, in a world without Christ, that's exactly what happens. In a world without Christ, you can make a choice for your life, and you can follow it. And every step of the way, each step seems okay until one day you look up, and where you are is not something you can get back from. So you simply can't. This is who you are, and this you're not coming back. I think one of the there's a lot of things that are happening with the way we're handling young people today, and I'm not going to pick something super controversial because I don't want you to get YouTube banned. So I'll pick something related that also happens to young people, which is the idea that you can drop out and hit the streets and live sort of on the road with your backpack or on your stuff, and urban camping, and it's basically a homeless type lifestyle, but it's by choice. And why? Because what is school? School is the man. What is jobs? It's the man. There's no hope. There's no future. You might as well hit the road and explore. And Dalrymple writes about it in Life in the Bottom. And I read a Twitter thread about a guy who did this and was very upfront about this life that he had, and here's how you can cheat, and here's how you can get resources, and here's how you can just keep moving and avoid the cops. And eventually he was challenged by people who have to clean up after that kind of stuff. And he admitted, that I'm kind of a degenerate loser in that respect. And I've tried to change now that I'm in my 20s, late 20s. I have a girlfriend. I'd like to have a life that's more stable so that we could have a family. And the pull the streets is so hard, I don't know if I can hold it together. And they get stuck. These young men especially get stuck, and they really can't get back. So once they've been on the streets long enough, it's nothing short of a miracle. Full on wraparound care, a whole team of people. We sponsored a church group and that did that for men who were in their 30s who had been on the streets for a decade or more. It took a team of people to give these people a chance, and they were well known because they had like a 50% success rate, which was unheard of. So good. So people get stuck. They make choices. They think it's easy. Society tells them there's no consequences. Every step along the way isn't so bad. And the habit becomes more and more ingrained. The identity becomes who they are. And that's, what do they do now? Where are they? Who knows?
Maybe the comparison there is that if you have rules, even if you don't understand the rules, you might find yourself like someone in the center of a maze, and you're trying to get to the exit, and it's taking you a while, and you're bumping into walls, and you're making dead ends, and it takes you a while to get to that exit. But then imagine there's no maze, and it's just you, and you don't know where that destination is because it's not marked in any way, and you're just wandering around. It will actually take you much longer to randomly wander into that spot than it would be if there was a maze leading you from there to here.
That's a really good image. Yeah.
So what we were saying with Victor Sells about whether or not he was ever a good person. I have one quote from this book, from chapter 21 of this book, and then one quote from book 14, Cold Front.
Okay.
So here, with just this book, you could go either way. Where she tells him, you don't know what it was like, and he was getting worse. He didn't start as a bad man, really, but he kept getting worse and worse, and I was afraid. But with this, you could sense that she might have been trying to rationalize. She might have been trying to minimize what it was he was doing. She said later, he was never a bad man, Mr. Dresden. You have to understand. He worked hard. He worked so hard for us to give us something better. I think it was because he knew that my parents had been so wealthy. He wanted to give me just as much as they could have, and he couldn't. It would make him so frustrating, so angry. Sometimes he would lose his temper, but he wasn't always so bad, and he could be so kind sometimes too. That does sound like it could go either way. It sounds like somebody who is, maybe is being abused, or on the other hand, it could sound like somebody who is describing how it actually was. You know, a man working hard who doesn't have complete control of his temper. But in book 14, Lily was describing his first 3 cases, and described Victor Sells as it destroys a father's love for his family by twisting it into maniacal ambition. And so she seems to be implying there that it did start out genuine. And that it was twisted into the Breaking Bad scenario that we see him in by the time the book starts.
Yeah.
I don't know how much credence you want to put to that, but between this, I get the sense that at one point he wasn't all bad. And we certainly know that it is possible in the Dresden Files universe to start out not all bad and become that way.
Yeah. And what's interesting, though, one of the things I love about some types of stories, that the superversive stories, is that that's a true thing, by the way. Everything you're describing is very accurate, very much true to the world. But there's not a lot of people who still tell stories where they take the opposite tack and say, and there's also people who over the course of their life find a way to get better, find a way to a path to redemption, a path to undo the wrong they've done. And I'm not just talking about the popular, so-called anti-hero where they just glamorize the guy and he eventually has a redemption arc, but they've never really made it clear about his victims, how awful he is, how much he deserves to damnation. And yet in Dresden stories, they're long enough and the stories have enough chance to pay out. You do get to see that without minimizing the evil, the bad guy can become a good guy, or at least on the road to being a good guy. That they've turned a corner and they're rejecting evil, and they're going to try to help everyone else reject it as well. So,
well, and there's different characters that are and okay, we're kind of talking about the series as a whole. There's different characters that hit different points on that. Thomas Wraith, and his trying to be better, trying to be better than he is kind of natural to him, having a lot of success for a while, and then running into something truly horrific that basically just wrecks all of that that he had tried to set up for himself. And then there's character we see in this very book, Johnny Marcone, gangster, criminal. At the same time, at several points in this series, he has effectively worked to protect different people of Chicago in different ways, because it's his territory. And so it's kind of interesting because again, this is talking about the series as a whole, not just this book, but I think Jim Butcher does that kind of thing fairly well. And then I kind of think about cases where I see people doing that pretty badly.
Mm-hmm.
And there's the show Heroes.
Oh yeah.
A good go. And the first season is fantastic, and then after that it kind of goes downhill.
Yeah.
But part of the reason it gets kind of silly after the first season is because they have this one character who, he's good. Well, he started out as evil, but now he's good. And then like 2 episodes later, now he's evil. And then 2 episodes later, now he's good again. And it's just kind of like this arbitrary stamp they're putting on the different characters rather than seeing real development of moral character and moral choices.
There's no outside frame for the universe in which Heroes is, which is Hollywood universe. There's no framework of objective reality. There's no good, there's no evil, there's nothing metaphysical that's real. It's all just whatever's happening this minute right now in the narrative. It just makes for terrible storytelling.
And also, like, good and evil aren't, based on like objective moral standards. They're more or less, stamps that the writers put on different characters at different points. And, they lay down, and this is kind of Hollywood as a whole, they lay down all kinds of clues. This is the person you're supposed to cheer for. And like, which is why storytelling, be very careful the kind of stories.
Protagonist-centered morality, as TV tropes would describe it.
Yeah, and be very careful the kind of stories you partake of, because basically one thing a lot of TV shows do is they will take a person, they will use all these different ways of getting you to sympathize with that person, and they'll have that person do objectively horrible things, but he's my friend, and that's how they shift what kind of things they use that to shift how people understand morality, how people think about right and wrong. And I think there's a lot of that is done very knowingly and deliberately. And so anyway, we are way out of the book.
Hey, I want to bring us back because it ties into what you just said. Because when I was reading the section with Jenny that you told us about Harry, and it took us back to something I was saying at the beginning about how the author tells you right away that Harry Dresden is someone who cares about right and wrong, and it starts off very general as he just doesn't want to be bad. I'm not going to be bad. He's not necessarily objectively going to be good. So he actually, the author sets that up for you and gives you sort of, I don't know if that's the right word for a magic trick or a prestige. It's like that movie. But there's like this turn where the story and it's going, and then there's this turn and it says, okay, from this point forward, we're going to drive toward the big payoff. And it's right there with Jenny saying, I hope you're one of the good guys, Mr. Dresden. We really need a good guy. I hope you'll be all right. And when it's from that moment forward, it never lets up until the moment when Harry is tempted to be evil multiple times, to choose wrong action. And he chooses goodness instead. But he never gives up his desire to help. And by the final end conclusion of the book, you get to the very end and he gives his little declaration of who I am. And it's, I'm going to fight for kids like Jenny. I'm going to fight for people like Jenny in the world. And you've just now got the character development, the whole arc of his character from someone who's just trying to survive and not be bad doing it, to someone who's going to be actively good in the world. And because this is a very well done world, it's not like, oh, there you go, story's over. Now I know he's a good guy. We're done. It's like, no. Now we've set the stage for all the drama to come because he's going to be a good guy in an evil world with lots of temptation to be otherwise. And it's like, okay, you've just got a 15-book series here now.
Well, so there's something else which is kind of really can relate to that. In the court, in terms of like the temptation he faces, that's actually one of my notes here, in chapter 24. In fact, I have the page number, so let me go to that quick. In my copy, it's page 317, but I don't know if that helps you. But let's see. Let's see. I could feel the air crackle with tension as I prepared to destroy the lake house, the Shadow Man, and any of the pathetic underlings he had with him. With such power, I could cast my defiance at the council itself, the gathering of white-bearded old fools without foresight, without imagination, without vision. And for one thing, like, this is like, again, casting the shadow cast back from the rest of the series. I've read Battleground. No, Harry. You could not defy the rest of the council with what you have here. Sorry, that's not going to work. But anyway, but also I guess
it says repeatedly, the guy currently in charge of the council, he's not called he didn't get the title of the Merlin by collecting box tops.
That's a good line.
Although also I guess it's kind of in narrative defense here, kind of adrenaline rush, and kind of like this, he is like kind of sucking up, absorbing a lot of power, and it is the kind of thing that like someone in a situation like that you might get this crazy idea of what you're capable of at that point. But then but then he gets called back to what it is he actually believes, and that's his mom, because he feels his mother's pentacle, and there's kind of a little hint that his mother's ghost may be having a hand in here, so to speak. But then in that chapter, and I don't know if there's a specific point there, but where that calls this up, but there is a question, and I don't, and I've seen Vox Day talk about this. Should Batman kill the Joker? Is the hero flat out killing the villain actually a bad thing to do? And I think one thing that weighs against that morally in this case is there is in fact this kind of established authority. There is a group that has clear rules and procedures that can and will handle this. The wardens of the White Council, if you put a finger on, if you lay a finger on this guy, you get them aware of it, they can and will deal with him quite handily. If Harry had been able to call a couple of wardens in for this job, as we see later, they would have dealt with Victor Sells without much trouble at all. And so, should Batman kill the Joker? And one argument in that particular case that weighs in Vox's favor of yes is apparently no one else is going to deal with him. Apparently, Arkham Asylum has terrible security, and he's just going to get out and do it again. So and once and for all, may be the most moral choice there. But anyway,
so hold on. I will say there was a Batman comic that had a very good rebuttal to that specific point.
Oh, good.
And that is Batman's job, at least the way he sees his own job, is assisting the law but not acting actually contrary to it. Killing the Joker is not fundamentally his job. If a court of law won't sentence the Joker to death, if a jury won't declare him guilty rather than insane, or if the police are so corrupt that they won't do it, or if the citizens of Gotham aren't going to clean up the police force and get a police force that will do it, if all that's true, that's on the inhabitants of Gotham itself. Batman captures criminals who normal law enforcement can't capture, but he's not the legal system in and of himself. If the people of Gotham want the Joker dead, they have to choose to do it. They can't just tell Batman to do their dirty work for him.
That is a good argument.
That's what one particular comic argued anyway, and that's I think a lot of the writers of Batman, well, when he's written well, obviously it varies, but when he's written well, I think a lot of the writers of Batman go with something roughly along those lines.
Well, and the my defense of the writers as like in terms of like this not necessarily being a morally corrupt storytelling on their part was just that like when you get a character like that, like replacing him in any meaningful sense is incredibly tough. I've seen third tier Batman villains. They're not good.
Calendar Man is not quite up to the same level.
Also, keep in mind, it was originally called Detective Comics, and it was more like the Shadow, and having your character kill people and step outside the law, as you say, does mess things up. And for Harry Dresden, it's the same way. If he steps outside the law that he's part of, both the law that he has to live in a mundane world in Chicago and the law that exists in the White Council, he's going to be in trouble, and he knows it, and there's going to be consequences to that. But the question that Butcher asks and answers a lot of the times is, all right, that's all well and good. You're following the law. You're rendering unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, but Caesar doesn't own the children's souls. Caesar doesn't own the damnation of vast numbers of innocents into the red or white vampires. So if you have the power to thwart the evil and you refuse to use it because you're constrained by the legal authorities, what do? And this is an ancient question. It goes back to a lot of our core religious sort of fourth commandment issues. And it's an important question. And that's what makes storytelling cool, is when you've got good versus good. What's the right thing to do? And you can get to different answers, and people can argue passionately and accurately that your answer might not be right. The other guy's answer might not be right. What is the right thing to do in this situation? And it's not always clear to the guy at the pointy end of the spear what's right.
Well, that actually that question actually reminds me of something that actually comes up as significant in a story I'm trying to write. This is C.S. Lewis's a collection of C.S. Lewis essays, God in the Dock. And at one point, one of the characters in the story is flipping through this and finds this. Let's see. Which there's the essay Delinquents in the Snow, and this is actually quoting someone else. Oh, here it is. Okay. And which is also a very relevant issue for the United States today, because he's basically talking about criminals going unpunished and almost given a pat on the back and almost encouraged by the system, depending on which kind. Anyway, but and the question that torments me is how long flesh and blood will continue to endure it. There was even not so long ago a question of whether they ought to. No one, I hope, thinks Dr. Johnson a barbarian, yet he maintained that if, under a peculiarity of Scottish law, the murderer of a man's father escapes, the man might reasonably say, I am amongst barbarians who refuse to do justice. I am therefore in a state of nature. I will stab the murderer of my father.
Yeah.
And like that's a real question.
It is a real question.
The main character of my story looks at that question and makes a decision. So if you're interested, by the way, in seeing that story, wasn't planning on mentioning this, but why not? I am publishing it in pieces as an ongoing blog. It's the title at the moment is The Mayor of Christ Mountain, and the story is it's available in progress at zacklog.wordpress.com. And I suppose I can include that link in the show description as well. But, again, the moral question of, like, the law, the system has failed. What is the right thing to do? Mm-hmm. Like, do you just say, oh, well, I guess this person goes, or do you say, and like, there's good arguments on both sides. It's not a I don't think it's an easy obvious win for either side of that question.
Yeah. Although it's actually kind of interesting now that them if they actually asked for divine assistance, which they don't often do in our stories anymore. I just reread Heidi, and characters are always having conversations with God about hard questions about what's right and what's wrong to do, and asking for divine guidance. And I don't blame people who aren't Christians for not following that path. I do blame people who have a religious worldview, Buddhist, Christian, what have you, for absolutely failing to treat the things they believe as if they were real in the stories they write. I think that's really foolish and even shameful as a writer to pretend that the things you claim to be true, have no impact on the stories you write or on the reality that you're building, this sub-creation you've built. I cannot count the number of Christian authors I've read who characters don't pray when they're in a foxhole, and I'm just thinking, really? Really?
A couple. As long as you can talk to God as long as you're in the right kind of story. And a couple years ago, Zacklog and I covered a story called Unsong, and quite a few characters did indeed talk to, a couple talked to God directly, and in this universe, divine communication takes place largely in the form of puns, and
that's pretty cool.
Less helpful. It's less helpful than you perhaps might think. So having characters able to directly ask means that you have to really, really be confident in the worldview that you are putting in the story. And because when you have a Deus Ex Machina in your story, there is no room for misinterpretation anymore. When you have characters who are doing their best and who are interpreting things, the characters might not be completely correct. Even if they're good people, they might be wrong. They might be misinformed, or they might be biased or something. But you have to be very, very confident at what you are putting in the mouth of God.
Oh yes, I wasn't saying that God would be talking back to you.
I see. I've never felt confident writing dialogue for that caliber, let's say, in my stories.
No, it was the other way around. Is the characters aren't talking to God.
Yes,
the way they would in if they were being drawn from life, and especially being drawn from life by a Christian. It's just so bizarre. Because Ursula Le Guin, before she went off the rails, wrote a beautiful series of books based on Buddhist beliefs, which apparently she shares, called The Wizard of Earthsea, The Tombs of Atuan, and The Farthest Shore. Characters are absolutely upfront about how their beliefs and the supernatural and affects them, and they act in accordance with nature. if you assume that this reality is real, which apparently she does, the characters behave in a way that makes sense. She wrote a beautiful communist novel, which asserted if the universe in which communism was real, was it The Dispossessed? I can't remember. And it worked because it was consistent within the world and the characters. She understood the characters, those were her beliefs. The characters portrayed them. And John C. Wright did the same thing as an atheist. When he needed to portray a universe in which Christianity was real. And he told that story. It was the part of the Awake in the Night series, and it's the final story in the series.
The final story was written after his conversion.
No, not the one in which he when they find their way out of heaven, they find their way out. He was still an atheist.
No, you're thinking Orphans of Chaos.
No, I'm thinking the Awake in the Night. That's it. Those books. He wrote them as an atheist, because I knew him then, and he was an atheist when he wrote them. But he had to.
All right, Zachlog is laughing because one of us is obviously wrong.
Okay,
Zachlog, which one is it?
I do not have information on this one. I do. Okay, I will say I do remember him talking about on the blog how he, as an atheist, wrote story. As an atheist, he has written stories that function in the Christian worldview, and he's also said, as a Christian, he's written some other stories that seem to follow a materialist atheist worldview, and it's just basically the kind of stories that come to him. He's not, at least with some of them, he's not trying to put forth a moral a moral framework. He's just writing this. The stories come to him from somewhere, and he's putting them out as best he's translating them as best he can. And so I think it entirely plausible that I don't have definite information, but I do think it's plausible that what she's talking about with Awakened Nightlands is correct.
And in fairness
from what I recall.
In fairness to Harry, I have a terrible memory, so I could be confusing this as well.
Fair.
Absolutely. However, it's true that he will unabashedly and I know that because this one I know that he wrote as an atheist, and he got accused in the campaign to end puppy-related sadness of writing it as Christian propaganda, which is the Mists of Everness. And I actually got that as a wedding present back in early 1990s, right, when I got married. So he was a definite fire-breathing atheist then. And the Christian characters, yes. The
Mists of Everness and his take on the Faust legend, the Fate of Fortune, were both definitely written when he was an atheist.
And so he treated the characters, the Christian characters, he treated them fairly and had them behave the way Christians would behave in terms of prayer and belief in what God would do and not do. And the fact that the universe didn't quite play out the way Christians think it should play out, because he wasn't a Christian, and the universe that he created had its own rules that weren't Christian rules, but were kind of adjacent because they were supernatural. That was
people
incredibly
still behaved like
honest.
People, yes.
And it's very strange to me when people don't do that. Butcher is very good at having his characters be fully fleshed out, and if they believe something is true, they act on it as if it were true, the way you would expect people to behave, even if it's not politically correct. So, pretty cool.
So, one thing I tend to look at in stories that I like. Or one thing I tend to kind of classify stories by is or at least adventure stories where there's a, conflict and, the hero wins, the hero comes out on top. And I tend to kind of broadly classify them as ones where the hero wins by being clever, by, figuring out something, or ones where the hero wins through moral courage, through doing the right thing, through self-sacrifice, through willingness to die if in a good cause. And I've read stories I've liked of both kinds. I do think the second one tends to make better stories, but I was kind of thinking about that towards the end of this one, and I don't think this really fits exactly into either, because basically how Harry wins is just sheer bloody-mindedness.
Yes.
Like, he's just not giving up. There's several points where he's like, okay, I guess I'm going to die now. And then something happens that kind of kicks his butt, and he's like, okay, I'm going to get back up and keep going. And like at another point, he's like, well, he's going to kill me, but he's going to have to kill me while I'm fighting him. And it's not exactly either of those two categories, but it is interesting. It's also kind of funny to me because I can remember there's a history podcast I listen to, Hardcore History by Dan Carlin, and he was he was talking about the history of Japan and basically what led up to their role in World War II.
I inadvertently started the war.
Well, and he said, we talk about, don't give up, don't surrender, and keep fighting. And he's like, and we consistently portray that as virtues, but he's like, it would have been a lot better for them in the long run if they had said at some point, I think we're done here. This is as much as we can do. I've also heard some people give some indication that Japan wanted to surrender, tried to surrender earlier, and America rejected that. I don't know about that part, but anyway.
I've been reading a guy who is talking about the whole world. These are people who are historians, and they're talking about Japan and World War II. And what do I know? Not an area of expertise. But one of the things they argued was something about, like in World War II, with the people work in Germany, the concept of working toward the Führer. The actual org table was a spaghetti mare's nest in Germany, but everybody knew kind of what the Führer wanted. The Führer himself didn't have direct control, and so everybody was like backstabbing each other, but they were all working toward what they thought the Führer wanted. And apparently Japan supposedly had similar things, with all these different factions all working toward the greater Japanese hegemony, with parts of the Japanese army and the government practically independent, and in one part, like maybe Manchuria, again, terrible memory, and other parts working counter to them in a different way. So you could have these different groups, kind of like we have now, with different people running the American government. We don't know who's really in charge, but there's all these different groups running it. We don't know who they are. Historians down the road are going to have a field day deciding what we knew and what we didn't know in any war that we get into, because so how do we know that Japan wanted to surrender? Well, maybe part of them did want to surrender. Maybe part of them didn't. Maybe there was this huge internecine fight. Maybe people from after World War I were determined to absolutely crush their enemy and have them utterly destroyed, so there was no chance that they could think that they'd won and come back and fight again and give us World War II. I don't know. I think you'd have to be a better historian than I am and have more access to the information from Japanese archives and all the people that were living at the time.
Zachlog, are you familiar with Bertrand Russell?
I know the name, but I don't have anything else at the moment.
So there's a specific people have called it a Russell's conjugation, although the concept is obviously much older than he is. And his specific example is that I am persistent, you are obstinate, and he is a pig-headed fool.
Yes. That's an old game.
I think that's the distinction you're going for here, where the very same thing is going to be anywhere between a virtue to neutral to an active vice, depending on whether or not you like the person who's doing it.
Yeah, well, and it's and also hindsight, like that's
and hindsight, yes.
There's let's see, one thing I have here. Again, I occasionally am just flipping through my notes. In chapter 26, penultimate chapter, the Harry finds a broom in the Cell's house in the middle of all this chaos, and he uses a sweeping spell to drive the scorpion monsters away while they're still relatively small. And one thing, I kind of want to see this come up again in the series, where he pulls that one out again for some random reason. For another thing, this actually reminds me of... What's up?
You're talking about Fantasia, right?
Well,
or the Sorcerer's Apprentice, more
yes,
generally.
Yes.
But anyway, and the other thing, it actually reminds me of an idea I've heard people talk about with like low-level D&D players, and low-level spell users in D&D, and like at some point you just start throwing around these massive power blasts, and like you're one level down from being a god, but at lower level, some people have said it's actually kind of fun because like you look at the things that are available to you, and a good playing is about making creative use of these different things. Like for instance, and I don't know which edition this was. This was a long time ago. I had these kind of conversations, and there's been like 3 editions of Dungeons and Dragons since then, and people got mad about one of them, or more. But there's a grease spell is one of the things in Dungeons and Dragons where basically you cast a spell and it makes the object of the spell effectively like lubricated, very slippery, and it's like, oh, we're running away from the town guards after this heist. Grease spell on the floor on the alleyway behind us, and all of a sudden they can't, like they're in a pile, and it's going to take them another 5 minutes to sort themselves out, stand up straight and sort themselves out while we're running, turning 3 corners in the meantime. And it kind of reminds, like Harry Dresden in this book kind of reminds me of that. It's like I don't have a lot, but I've got to make creative use of these things that I've got that I have available, and I think that also makes for a pretty interesting story.
Yeah, well, you could use summon water and douse, which is very low level spell. Summon water, douse the one lantern in the room. Now it's pitch dark, and your character can see in the dark. Out you go. So yeah, that's a lot of fun.
When all you have is you get really good at making your problems look like nails.
Yep, this is true.
That actually reminds me of a reference to a movie a lot of people hate. I kind of enjoy it, although I kind of understand why people hate it. It's The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen.
Yes.
And it's one of the ones where I'm like, yes, I understand why you hate it.
Mixed. I love the premise and hate the execution. The premise is absolute genius. Mm-hmm.
Well, it is from a comic, so like if you thought the movie came out badly, you might dig up the comic.
I've never seen the movie.
Okay. Oh, you thought you didn't like the comic's execution. Mm-hmm. Anyway, okay. Yes. But at one point, Alan Quatermain, who is, in terms of his abilities, he is a skilled standard human. Like he doesn't have anything, extra normal abilities that I'm aware of. He's just very good at what he does. But he gets into a fight with the Invisible Man at one point in the movie, And the first thing he does when he realizes what's happening, he grabs the lamp in the room and he smashes it. And now they're in darkness, and the Invisible Man doesn't have any particular advantage when nobody can see anything. Yes. Which I thought that was I thought that was a pretty good move. Yeah,
it's in the Dresden boss fight at the end. The Harry Dresden basically throws a film canister at the bad guy and utterly undoes all the major plot that was going to happen. I mean, the thing that he's been terrified is going to happen to him almost from the very beginning when he realizes what this guy's power is and what he can do to Harry, he just ends it because he knows something, and you know it too, because Harry, the author, set it up for you. He throws a film canister in it and breaks the charm, and boom, everything that was going to do insta kill to Harry is now undone. Plus, things get kind of hairy for, as it were, for the big bad. Yeah, it's like that. You have set the rules up. There's a lot of tools that you can use to do the fight. It doesn't always have to be the big, bad, explosive thing. It can be very satisfying sometimes to have just a little thing that you've set up earlier on. This little tool that you've got, picked it up, put it in your pocket, and now you're using it to win the day, which was why you always have a backpack in D&D, and anything you see, you loot and you keep it if you can, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. You never know what's going to come in handy.
Yep, never.
Which is why more D&D long-term D&D characters should be developing back problems. But
there you go.
That's what bags of holding are for.
Mm-hmm.
You have your pocket dimension do your carrying for you.
Or in the case of the Rachel Griffin books, which I love, you basically have a portable house that you can climb into and stack things up in.
Let's see. Oh,
Speaking of things that changed in the years between now and 2000, when the book was first published, do you guys remember when cell phones finally showed up in the Dresden verse, in the stories? Because that's a huge story element. Being able to communicate with people instantly around the world.
Doing a quick Control F, it seems like it's book 5, Death Masks.
Okay.
But that's it might have shown up earlier in a different with a different word that I'm not searching for. But that's the first time it shows up, and once it shows up, the phrase shows up a lot in book 5 and onward, obviously.
Let's see. So, go ahead.
Oh, I'm just wanted to mention, Death Masks was published in 2003, so it wasn't even that much later than Stormfront.
Yeah.
But it's amazing how fast that changed.
Okay, so one note of significance here in chapter. So again, flipping back quite a bit now. Chapter 9, Harry goes to meet with Bianca. Yeah, who is the vampire who runs a brothel. Later we find out she's a Red Court vampire, but at the moment she's just a vampire. And Harry ends up pulling out his mother's pentacle amulet, and basically this works as a holy symbol to drive her off. And
you want to come see the funny meme?
I do not. This one kind of annoys me a good bit because it's just his faith in this thing, and it could be whatever thing, and it's like, okay, so like a devoted Marxist pulls out a communist flag. Is that going to drive off the vampires? It's like it's just because you believe in something doesn't mean it's good. And it, well, okay. Now, I will say another thing in, kind of Butcher's defense here. This is also as being told by Harry Dresden, and, just because Dresden says it does not mean that's how things actually work. And
That's
I have
right.
seen, I can't bring up an example off the top of my head, but we have seen things later in the series where Dresden told us X earlier, but we find out the case is actually Y. That's not because doesn't have to be filed as a retcon. That's just because he didn't know about these other factors at this other point. But yeah, like faith in X is going to drive off of people can have faith in horrible things, and I don't think that's necessarily going to drive off an evil creature just because you believe.
It doesn't make sense within the context of the world that it would drive off a vampire or any other evil creature. It does make sense that the item's power, its mana, its magic, is dependent on the power of the belief and the will, because we see that you can take all these strong emotions and power magic. So it makes sense within the world that the power of the item is dependent on the degree of belief you have in it, the sincere, powerful, passionate emotion you've been feeding into it. So the pendant would work in that effect as a talisman if you've imbued it with talismanic power to ward off certain types of creatures, partly because of the belief, partly because you're a magician and you know how to cast the spell the right way. But you shouldn't be able to have some random person do it unless they've got some latent magic ability and they're creating it without knowing it, based on the way the universe is built. What do you think?
I'll play Vampire's Advocate on this one. The concept of the threshold for a house. Dresden mentions at one point that the threshold gets weaker or stronger depending on the love that the person has for the place that he is in. And we see it specifically comes up with Michael Carpenter's house. Harry compares it to his own and says, I do like my apartment, but I'm one guy who happens to live there. I'm not as attached to it. When you are raising a family in a house, you come to love that house in an entirely different way. And the threshold is correspondingly vastly stronger. And that's without Michael Carpenter having to actually invest active magic into it or anything. That's just how thresholds work in this universe.
Okay.
And I say that, I found it irritating the same way. There was a Doctor Who episode called The Curse of Fenric in the Sylvester McCoy era in 1989 that had exactly the same rules, and that irritated me. And there was a John C. Wright story, Somewhither, which you have probably read, which explicitly did the opposite.
Yes, loved it.
And it mentions, Iliad mentioned at one point, the crucifix it's not going to work for me. You have to have faith for that to work. And the question is, well, who told you that? A movie I saw. All right, well, the movie was in the pay of the movie makers. The vampires were paying them to say that.
Which they would do.
Which they would do, yes. And then the question is, do you think it's your name? Do you think it's your power that commands the unseen spirits? No. That was the answer in that universe was no. It really is exactly the symbol. You have a cross to repel vampires, and you have the Seal of Solomon to contain golems. And I forget what you had for mummies, but there was when they encountered the mummy, there was something else there, and your faith had nothing to do with whether or not that was going to work.
It was the power of the supernatural being whose attention was focused on it. Yes, whose attention
you were gathering with that symbol.
But the Vampire's Advocate makes sense, though, in the sense that, let's say you have a cross that, I'm not wearing mine, but it was given to you by your grandparents, and it was a gift for their 50th wedding anniversary. It's been passed on to you. So it's got all of this great, powerful love, and it's imbued with it's a Christian family as well, so there's that going on for it. So now this is now a talisman against vampires because of the love that exists that they find so toxic. That makes sense, but it wouldn't make sense that a random, even if you had a lot of faith in it, some random cross that I held up would necessarily be particularly powerful because I haven't imbued it with that much love, unless I've been, on my knees and praying about it, and it was from my, a crucifix that I have my prayer nook or something. Just some random crucifix I picked up. It shouldn't work at all. Like I said, I find it not very coherent in the sense of the world that he's built.
So one thing I wanted to...
Well, it depends, because we don't, at least in this book, we don't see anybody trying to use a random crucifix to repel a vampire.
Yeah,
and we'll have to wait until somebody tries it, because I genuinely can't remember if anybody's actually tried that in this series. If somebody tries it and it fails, then I think it's the threshold thing. If somebody tries it and it works, well, then then you're probably right that it's an inconsistency in the universe. But I don't remember if anybody's actually done it.
Yep.
So one thing I wanted to mention in terms of like the idea of the threshold in these stories, I saw a note outside, like, not in any particular story, but Butcher was answering questions, and the temple foo dog, or whatever, I don't know if I have the right name, but whatever wherever mouse comes from, he had said outside one of the stories, basically their power is proportional to the threshold they're guarding. And then I was like, oh, okay. And I was like, oh, so he spent maybe a year or so at the carpenter's house.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that makes sense that Nicodemus is, kind of scared when he shows up at the end of Skin Game.
That makes it, yeah.
Okay. We are coming up. There's a lot of stuff we could talk about at different points in this book. We are coming up to 2 hours, though.
Oh, my
goodness.
And
most of the stuff we want to talk about is stuff that we'll have to wait for future videos anyway, if we want to pace it out as well as Jim Butcher himself.
So, are there any last, let's see, Hobbit, are there any last big thoughts you wanted to make sure you put in here?
I want to save this for a future discussion, whether I'm here or not. Is Harry Dresden the ultimate Gen X hero? Save it for later, though.
Okay. He's not cynical enough. He actually gets involved. Anyway, and Harry, how about you? Any last thoughts? Any big notes you wanted to cover that we didn't get before we close out for the night?
The fact that this ends, I'm in the book. I hope that whenever Jim Butcher finishes this series, whether it be that in another 30 years, I hope he finishes that same way, and half the audience will have no idea what book he could possibly be referring to, or would assume that the book he's referring to is the book that they're reading.
That would be cool.
I have a dream. I want to see it happen.
Okay. Well, thank you both for joining me for this talk. And anyone who's watching and has stuck out this long, thank you. I hope you found it interesting. And
if you don't, good job on watching this long. Thank you.
You're here.
All right. Good night.
Good night.